Guys, I hate all of these champions. Like, I know this is just my opinion, but I hate every single one of these. Every new champion they release, I just hate it. And I hate the game more and more per every single release.
You mean another nerf? Okay, thank God. Still gonna be broken though because she fundamentally breaks League of Legends. So it really doesn't matter what you nerf unless they target her being invulnerable.
Seriously, who thinks Silas, Zoe, Kiana, Yumi, and reworked Akali provide anything but shit and feces to this game?
Are they imbeciles? Do they know how to fix the fucking champion? Huh? How is that healthy gameplay? That was off-screen one-shot. She legitimately one-shot my team off the screen. Zero counterplay.
Oh, yeah.
There's a common sentiment within the community that modern champion design has been slowly killing the game, where just hearing the words rework or champion release gets people worried, but are modern champions actually as bad as people say they are? While in a few ways, champion design has gotten better over the years, with more skill expression and depth that make the game more mechanically intensive, in many more ways, champion design has gotten a lot worse over the years, with each new release and rework making the game progressively more toxic and frustrating. Today I want to go over why this is the case and what we could do to fix it. Now I know this is a pretty loaded debate, and over the years I've heard many different takes on this, but I believe it's not really that complicated of an issue, nor is it something that would take too long to be able to realistically fix. I believe there are three main reasons why modern champion design is so hated, which is a lack of opportunity, a lack of respect for the game, and an increasing amount of overloaded kits. And while outside factors like runes and items do have an impact on this sentiment, I just want to keep it quick and simple by sticking to only champion design. So without wasting any more time, let's get into the first.
All souls are forfeit. You got too deep.
When I say champions lack opportunity, what I mean is that their kits lack points of weakness or counterplay that an enemy could play off of. For example, let's look at Mordekaiser. His passive, second passive, third passive, fourth passive, and R are all impossible for an enemy to dodge, with his Q hitbox being so large that in a majority of cases, it's realistically impossible that he can miss. The only ability that you can realistically dodge from his kit is his E active, and it's only a small fraction of his actual power, where him missing it doesn't really affect the outcome of the fight at all, unless in very specific situations. And you might think, well yeah, that's kind of the point of League. It's not the most mechanically intensive game, and is much more centered around macro, with things like knowing what to build, when to engage, and how to farm. But that doesn't mean there can't be points of opportunity to a champion's kit. Take Set for example. His W is a very strong ability that can single-handedly turn a losing fight into a winning one, but because of the hard-to-hit sweet spot converting its damage from physical to true, it means that a significant portion of the damage can be avoided by the enemy playing well. The way his W stacks also means the enemy can chip away at him without stacking his W too much, or by chunking him with a quick trade and then running away, since the shield will then be wasted. Same with his E, where the enhanced effect will only occur if he hits an enemy from both sides, which means that the enemy can understand this and outplay him by positioning correctly. What these small points of weakness do is give the enemy and the set player opportunity to outplay their opponents and get a lead because of it, whether that means a good trade or a kill. And a big reason this is the case is because of the fact that they are balanced in a way where missing them is a punishment rather than hitting being a reward. The reason this is such a big deal is because of the low skill nature of the game, with things like auto attacks and easy to hit abilities, and how a lead can often mean you don't need to play very well to win, which only increases more and more the bigger of a lead you get. punishing the Set for missing a bunch of his damage means the amount of a raw stat lead he needs is much higher and makes missing more of a threat to Set. And in case you're still confused, let's look at 2 more examples. Thresh's Q is a well-made ability for many reasons, but in particular, it has a little subtext that most people don't even know that reduces its cooldown by 3 seconds when he hits an enemy. Most people see this and think, wow, that's really dumb, it just makes him more overloaded. But then when you look at the base cooldown of his Q and compare it to other champions who do something similar, you see that the base cooldown is longer, and the 3 seconds refunded when it hits is essentially making up for the higher base cooldown. And just like what I went over with Set, it makes it so that if Thresh misses, his cooldown is now longer by 3 seconds and is a punishment, rather than if his base cooldown was the same as the others and the 3 seconds was a reward for hitting instead. Another example is Cassiopeia. I'm sure everyone knows about her ult, and how if you catch the enemy looking in your direction, it becomes a stun rather than a slow, but more notably, and what is probably a better example to help understand the point, is her E. On its own, it's a pretty simple and uninteresting ability that doesn't deal very much damage, making it pretty weak. But when the enemy is poisoned, it becomes a much better ability, dealing bonus damage and healing her for a significant amount that suddenly makes it a lot stronger. Now imagine if its base power was the strong version, and when an enemy was poisoned, it got even stronger. It would be a lot more frustrating and oppressive to play against Cassiopeia, since dodging her Q and W to avoid the poison wouldn't really matter since she could just spam her E's and win anyway. This is what a large majority of champions have, where their abilities are strong, but then they also have these little bonuses that make them even stronger. Another similar issue is the amount of champions that do have points of opportunity, but then also have other aspects of the kit that completely make up for them and negate them. For example, Aatrox. Aatrox's Q and W are both pretty interesting abilities, which both feature points of opportunity that an enemy could use to outplay them, but when put together, the W counterplay of being able to walk out is negated by the fact that the Q knocks up, and the Q counterplay of being dodgeable is negated by the fact that the W pulls them into an easy predict spot, making it so that unless you are a specific champion who can dodge the Q knockup, there's not really any counterplay to what is essentially his full combo. Another example is Pyke. Pyke's E can be juked by walking in the opposite direction of Pyke, which avoids a significant amount of his power, but when he hits his Q, it has a random 90% slow for a full second, which makes it virtually impossible to be able to juke, and just like Aatrox, it makes it so that unless you are a specific champion, you have no counterplay to it. And this is the problem, where it creates a scenario of champions having counter picks rather than counterplay, and makes it so there isn't really that much skill involved, which simultaneously makes it a lot less rewarding to use, as well as frustrating to verse if you get counterpicked. And another thing adding points of opportunity to kits adds is a much better pro play viewing experience, because there is a lot more skill to the game and opportunity for a player to show and express their mastery. Like when you watch a game like CSGO or Smash and see someone pull off a crazy high skill moment, you're amazed and get hyped. But when you watch League and see the Aatrox get a 1v1 kill by hitting a combo that was essentially unmissable, it isn't really all that impressive or hype at all. The most viewed highlight moment of League's history, being the ZvZ matchup, was so hyped because it was a unique opportunity for someone to really express their mastery and skill of the game. And there's a reason nothing in the past several years has really come close to that. This topic is very heavily tied to game design and the unwritten rules of the game, like classes and what they feature. To explain what I mean, I want to ask a simple question. What is the point of armor in League of Legends? I'm sure most people can pretty easily explain what armor is, but that's different to the reason for its existence. The point of armor in League of Legends is to add a layer of depth and skill to the game, where instead of all damage just being one type and characters only having a damage and health stat, the difference between physical and magic damage lets the player play around the opponent and adapt to what they are doing. For example, say you're playing Darius top lane against 3 AD and 2 AP. Normally you might want to go a bit into armor and then a bit into MR for an even balance so one person can't just be able to blow you up in fights. But then, you notice that 10 of the 13 kills on the other team are all on the AD champions, So what you might want to do is build a lot more armor to be stronger against more of the enemy's average power. And then, on the other side of things, those AD champions can see you are stacking armor to counter them, and they can choose to devote their resources into armor penetration to be able to play around you, creating a fun macro element to the game that wouldn't exist if everything was just ideal damage to your health bar. And this macro element is a big aspect and appeal to the game, which makes it very skill expressive and fun to try and get good at. Now, imagine if they added a character with damage that ignored all armor, meaning that even if the opponent had the skill to be able to counter it, they literally just couldn't. That would suck, right? I mean, it removes a significant layer of skill from the game. And this is what I mean by a lack of respect for the game. Of course, I was talking about true damage here, but this also includes % max HP scalings, any damaging ability that scales with non-damage based stats like armor or mana, and the toxic relation some champions have to crit. The reason non-damage based stats like armor scaling up a champion's damage is an issue is because it directly correlates to items and causes those champions to randomly have more artificial power by making some stats cost effectiveness higher, and causes issues with the items since you can't have a subtext on them that reads, "And by the way, this champion is half as effective on this champion." In addition to this, defensive stat scalings also heavily contribute to the counterpick meta, with champions like Galio and Rammus. Like, Rammus on his own isn't even all that terrible of a champion, simply being another variation of the tanky diver archetype that wants to get into the opponent's face and keep them busy. But the fact that his passive, and subsequently his W, scales with armor means that he has a very deceptively high amount of damage despite being able to build full tank. And the reason crit on non-marksman champions is an issue is because crit is fundamentally designed to separate other AD classes from the marksman, since they all use AD. The way it does this is by needing a pretty heavy investment to be good, having very limited stat diversity, and only applying to basic attacks. What this means is that a Renekton could build crit, but since much of his damage is in his abilities, which can't crit, as well as the fact that he will have little to no survivability from the crit item's stat diversity, means that he will be very fragile and not even get that much value out of the crit compared to something like a Jinx, who doesn't need the extra survivability as much and can get much more value out of the crit due to her basic attack emphasis. But then for some reason, champions like Yone, Yasuo, and Tryndamere randomly get to ignore these fundamental balance points of crit by only needing 1 or 2 of the crit items, having their abilities count as basic attacks, and since they only need 1 or 2, meaning they can use the rest of the inventory slots to pick up items their classes are balanced for, which typically have much better stat diversity. And since the crit items are only balanced for marksmen, it means that these champions can conveniently abuse things like shield bow, making it much better when placed on a champion that has the balance of a skirmisher. And this is also why nothing short of removing their interaction with crit altogether could help fix the issue. In addition to these stats, a lack of respect for the game also extends to the abilities themselves. For example, Volibear. Volibear is a Juggernaut, which means as a Juggernaut he features good damage, good survivability, and good dueling power, but with the downside of a low range, very low mobility, low CC, and a very weak teamfighting presence. But then Volibear also randomly has a leap that makes him negate a bunch of this innate weakness that Juggernauts should have. Same with Mordekaiser, and how his ult makes up for the lack of mobility, low range, and low CC by making enemies literally unable to run away, while simultaneously giving him good teamfighting presence by being able to remove someone else from the fight like an ulting Fiddlesticks. And it doesn't stop at abilities either. Remember when Stridebreaker was giving Juggernauts a bunch of extra mobility? Or how Eclipse gives assassins % armor pen, survivability, and % max HP damage? Or how Sunfire is being abused by champions like Diana because it gives them the survivability they should be lacking, while also being decent at consistent DPS? And I've heard the argument of, well, that's their gimmick, so it makes sense. And while I disagree that every champion needs to be entirely unique to every other champion, it doesn't even really correlate to needing to break the game to work. For example, Yumi's W is fundamentally game-breaking, with how she can be invulnerable and sit on allies, but it's more so how long she can sit on the ally, because of the fact that the only part of her kit that incentivizes her to hop on and off is a fraction of her power, and often even disincentivizes Yumi from hopping off since your teammate can easily outrun you before you can hop back on, since Yumi doesn't build boots or attack speed. Making it so that she needs to hop on and off or in between allies for a lot more of her power means that the enemies have more opportunities to catch her and blow her up, while also giving more skill expression to the Yuumi by understanding when to and when not to. Another example is Renata's W and her gimmick of bringing an ally back. The issue isn't really that she can bring allies back, but it's more so that it lasts for a full 5 seconds, which means Renata can just throw it on a dive champion like Tristana, and even if she dies, there's a high chance she'll have done enough damage to be able to bring herself back. Giving the revive mechanic a strict parameter, like only reviving teammates if they die within half a second of putting the W on them, adds a lot more skill expression, not only for the enemies since they know they haven't seen the W and are expecting her to go for the revive, and the Renata who needs to know when to use it for the steroids and when to try to use it as a revive. In addition to this, when the abilities have these powerful mechanics, it very often means to keep the champion balanced, Riot needs to weaken the ability or the kit as a whole to compensate. A good example of this happening is with Kaele's rework and how they made her W always heal herself, but gave her the ability to also heal a teammate if they're in range, meaning Kaele's W is effectively doubled in strength. Because of this new power, Riot nerfed its base healing by almost half, its AP ratio by almost half, increased its mana cost by a full 30 mana at all ranks, and reduced the duration of movement speed by a second for the small compensation of slightly increasing its movement speed. Lastly, we have overloaded champions, which is a topic that is very popular among the community, but something that has never really been defined and is very vague, where people say general things like when they have too much on their kits, or when you need to read an essay to understand the ability, which makes it too vague and open to interpretation. A good example was Set, and how people labeled him as overloaded because his W was hitting like a truck, or how people were comparing Kled's passive to Alistar's kit and using that as a way to explain why Kled is overloaded. Well, I believe there are two types of overloaded: versatility overload and unnecessary overload. Versatility overload is essentially just an easy to understand term that covers the first two topics I went over, where champions have aspects of their kits that go against the fundamentals of the game, like what a class is and how they are balanced, which ends up making them lack any sort of real counterplay that an enemy could play off of. You can almost think of it like a lack of macro opportunity, rather than a lack of micro opportunity, where if the enemy picks Fiora and you are Malphite, then you might want to group more where you have more of an advantage, but then instead of Fiora it's a Yone, who is a skirmisher that is just as strong in 1v1s, but then also has one of the best team fighting ultimates in the game, so you can't even out macro him and pull him into a less optimal spot. Versatility overload is always made up of passive effects and active effects, and makes the champion oppressive because when they get ahead, there's nothing the enemy can do except just hope the Yone messes up enough times. Unnecessary overload, on the other hand, is always made up of passive stats, and is typically pretty easy to locate and fix. The issue unnecessary overload creates is that the stat passives do nothing but artificially add more power into the game, which has a direct impact on many other things like items, but more noticeably makes the game much more oppressive in certain scenarios. A perfect example is Nyla's Q, and how she can randomly gain an absurd amount of percent armor pen, healing, and shielding for doing literally nothing. This passive makes it incredibly oppressive against certain champions and means that while she might have a 50% win rate, it's because she is absolutely shit-stomping some champions with no counterplay at all and getting shit-stomped by others. Because the counterbalance to that amount of power would have to be that the rest of her kit is weaker to get her to ride golden 50% misconception. And for something that adds very little to the champion and almost always adds no player interaction or skill expression, the downsides heavily outweigh the positives. These points in particular were a big issue around the start of 2016, when champions first started being released and reworked as these unbalanced monstrosities that were very often overloaded in both aspects. And it's a big reason we think back on that period as the most toxic the game has ever been, because those new champions were the minority of the roster and were contrasted by the more simplistic champion designs. And it's why, as the minority slowly morphed into the majority, and recently into the entirety, we've become more and more accustomed to it and have started to forget what the game used to be like and what made the game so fun, with some people even starting to say the game is in the best spot it's been in a while. But that idea is just wrong. It's not that Riot have fixed any issues, It's just that the baseline for what is an issue got so high that the old issues have become the norm.